The first rifle shot echoed across Shadow Lake, like thunder trapped between the red sandstone bluffs, followed immediately by the terrified scream of Clara Winthrop's horse as it plunged into the muddy shallows. The stolen Mercury purchase records scattered from her grip, like guilty secrets exposed to daylight, their pages fluttering across the water's surface as she fought to stay afloat in the deepening lake. Behind her, 3 of Silas Crowley's hired guns spurred their mounts down the rocky slope, their weapons glinting in the harsh August sun of 1881. Clara had known this moment would come, the instant she discovered those damning documents spread across Crowley's desk. Proof that every woman in Dakota Territory who'd been branded as barren had actually been systematically poisoned by mercury runoff from his mining operation. The water closed over her head as she struggled with the weight of her waterlogged riding dress, her lungs burning as she surfaced and gasped for air. Through the chaos of splashing and gunfire, she glimpsed a figure emerging from the willows on the far shore, a Lakota warrior on a paint horse moving with liquid grace across the treacherous mudflats. He reached her just as the second volley of shots sent geysers of water erupting around them. Without hesitation, the warrior slipped from his mount into the lake beside her, his knife flashing as he cut away the worst of her hampering skirts. 3 shooters on the ridge, he said calmly, his dark eyes steady despite the bullets striking the water nearby. Can you reach that fallen tree? Clara nodded, following his lead, as they swam toward the cover of a massive cottonwood that had toppled into the lake. The bark was rough against her palms as she pressed herself against its bulk, acutely aware of the man beside her and the controlled power in his movements, the network of battle scars that spoke of conflicts survived and lessons learned in blood. "But why are you helping me?" she gasped between rifle reports. He studied her face with the intensity of someone reading a map in dangerous country. "Because men who shoot at women carrying papers usually fear the truth those papers contain." The warrior Takala, Joe, she would later learn, rose from behind their shelter and fired 3 precise shots at the ridge. One of the attackers cried out and tumbled from his saddle, while the other 2 retreated hastily, apparently deciding their wages weren't worth dying for. As the echoes of gunfire faded across the lake, Clara found herself studying her unexpected savior. Perhaps 35 years old, he bore the weathered features of someone who had lived through the Indian Wars. A burn scar across his ribs was visible through his torn cavalry shirt, and his movements carried the careful economy of a man who had learned to waste neither motion nor ammunition. "Those papers," he said, gesturing toward the documents still floating among the cattails. "Are they worth more than your life?" Clara looked across the lake's surface, where the evidence of Crowley's crimes was slowly sinking beneath the murky water. They're proof that 17 women in this territory lost their babies, not because they were cursed or defective, but because they were murdered by mercury poisoning. The weight of that statement hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Takala's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his dark eyes, a recognition of shared understanding about the price of injustice. "Including you," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara's throat tightened as she nodded. The memory of her 2 miscarriages still cut like fresh wounds, the crushing shame, the whispered accusations of being barren, the slow dissolution of a marriage that couldn't survive the weight of repeated loss. "Then we gather what evidence we can," Takala said, already moving toward the scattered papers. "And we make certain the truth reaches people who matter." 3 days later, Dr. Edwin Harper arrived at the Lakota camp as the evening cooking fires were being lit, his medical bag clutched in hands that showed only the slightest tremor of approaching age. At 52, Harper had practiced frontier medicine long enough to treat wounds by instinct as much as training, and his weathered face bore the calm competence of someone who had seen every variety of human suffering. "Let me examine that bullet graze," he said to Takala, settling cross-legged beside the warrior's teepee with the easy familiarity of old friendship. Clara watched from nearby as Harper cleaned and stitched the wound with methodical precision. The camp itself contained perhaps 30 lodges arranged near the lake's shore in traditional fashion, with children playing between the teepees, while women worked at various domestic tasks. But she noticed details that spoke of constant vigilance, weapons always within reach. Horses kept ready for quick departure men who moved with the alert awareness of soldiers in hostile territory. Dr. Harper treats all people equally, explained Winona, an elderly woman who had introduced herself as Tokala's grandmother. When the spotted fever came 3 winters ago, he stayed in our camp for weeks, sleeping little, asking no payment except that we share our knowledge of healing plants. As Harper finished his work, Clara spread the water-damaged documents on a blanket beside the fire. Even in their damaged state, the records told a devastating story of environmental destruction carried out with deliberate malice. 3 years of mercury purchases, she said, pointing to the relevant columns. Enough to process thousands of tons of ore with all the contaminated waste dumped directly into Willow Creek. Harper studied the figures with a physician's understanding of their implications. Sweet Jesus. That much mercury in the water supply would explain everything we've been seeing. The miscarriages, the birth defects, the mysterious neurological problems affecting people downstream from the mine. But there's more. Clara continued producing another set of documents. Payment records showing systematic corruption. Sheriff McKean has been receiving regular consultation fees from Crowley, along with Judge Morrison and at least 3 territorial legislators. As they discussed the evidence late into the evening, Walter Briggs appeared at the edge of the firelight. The rancher was perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered hands and honest face of someone who worked the land for an honest living. Clara recognized him as one of the men who had been hauling tailings for Crowley's operation. Miss Winthrop. He said, his hat clutched nervously in his hands. I need to make a confession. I've been working for Crowley, hauling contaminated waste to dumping sites around the territory. Told myself it was just business, but after what happened to my own wife. His voice trailed off, and Clara saw genuine anguish in his weathered features. She lost a baby last spring. 3rd miscarriage in 2 years. Doctor said it was God's will, but now I'm thinking it was my own hands that poisoned the water she drank. Walter pulled a folded receipt from his shirt pocket. Found this in the load I was supposed to dump tomorrow. It's got dates and locations that match up with some of the worst contamination sites. I can't live with this on my conscience anymore. Clara took the document, recognizing Crowley's official seal and distinctive handwriting. The receipt detailed payments for waste disposal in areas that would maximize contamination of local water sources, a deliberate pattern of environmental destruction designed to cause maximum harm to the surrounding population. Why are you coming forward now? Tokala asked. Walter's face crumpled with grief and guilt. Because I just figured out that I've been carrying poison to every water source in the territory. My wife, your people, all the families downstream, we're all drinking death because of what I've been hauling for Crowley. The confession hung in the air like smoke, heavy with the weight of unwitting complicity. Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at the man who had participated in her suffering, sympathy for his obvious remorse, and hope that his testimony might finally bring justice. I'll testify, Walter said firmly. Whatever it takes to make this right, I'll do it. As the fire burned low and people began retiring to their lodges, Tokala walked Clara to the small shelter that had been prepared for her use. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scents of sage and wood smoke that seemed to cleanse her lungs after months of breathing the contaminated air around Willow Springs. Tomorrow they will come for you, he said quietly. Crowley cannot allow those documents to reach territorial authorities. Clara nodded, having reached the same conclusion. I can leave, find somewhere else to hide until... No. The word was spoken with quiet finality. You are under the protection of the Kit Fox Society now. My people have voted, and the decision is unanimous. She looked at him in the starlight, seeing the weight of leadership in his straight shoulders and steady gaze. This was not merely one man's decision. but a commitment from an entire community. Why, she asked, you barely know me. Tokala was quiet for a long moment, his attention fixed on Shadow Lake's silver surface. When he spoke, his words carried the formal cadence of ceremonial declaration. In my teepee you would be blessed between my sheets, not by magic or medicine, but by safety, warmth, food, and the protection of people who understand that justice is worth fighting for. The offer was both practical and profound sanctuary, when she had nowhere else to turn belonging, when she had been cast out by her own society. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what he was truly offering. Not romance, but partnership in a battle that transcended personal attraction. Your people don't know me, she whispered. They know courage when they see it. And they know that sometimes the spirits send help in unexpected forms. His gaze found hers in the moonlight. We are all broken in some way, Clara Winthrop. The question is whether we let the breaking destroy us or forge us into something stronger. The sound of many horses approaching through the pre-dawn darkness brought the entire camp to instant alertness. Clara jerked awake in her borrowed shelter, her body tensing with the primal awareness of prey that knows the predators are closing in. Around her, the Lakota community stirred to wakefulness, with the silent efficiency of people who had lived with danger long enough to respond without panic. Tokala appeared at her entrance, his face painted for war and his Spencer carbine ready for action. 6 riders approaching from the south. Military horses official bearing. This is not a social visit. Through the growing light, Clara could see warriors taking defensive positions while women and children quietly moved toward predetermined evacuation routes among the willows. The precision of their movements spoke of countless rehearsals for exactly this kind of emergency. The riders emerged from the morning mist like harbingers of doom, and their leader sitting his black stallion with the arrogant bearing of absolute authority. Silas Crowley had come calling in person, bringing with him the kind of armed intimidation that frontier territories respected above all other forms of law. At 50, Crowley retained the powerful build of the mine laborer he had once been, though his tailored coat and polished boots spoke of the wealth he had accumulated through less honest means. Behind him rode Sheriff Rattler McKean, his pale eyes scanning the camp with predatory interest, followed by 4 hired guns whose hard faces promised violence at the first sign of resistance. "On a morning, folks." Crowley called out, his voice carrying false joviality that fooled no one. "Sorry to disturb your rest, but we have pressing business to discuss." Tokala stepped forward, his rifle held with casual readiness. Around him, other warriors materialized from concealment, like ghosts taking solid form. Clara counted at least 8 visible defenders, though she suspected more remained hidden in the surrounding vegetation. "This is Lakota land," Tokala said calmly. "State your business and depart in peace." McKean's hand drifted toward his sidearm. "Not Indian land, boy. This here's Dakota territory under lawful jurisdiction of the United States government, which would be represented by me, meaning we need you people to pack up and move along." Crowley added, his tone reasonable, but his eyes cold as winter water. "I'm expanding my mining operation, and this lake sits exactly where I need to build my new processing facility." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. Crowley wasn't just trying to recover his stolen documents. He was making a play for complete control of Shadow Lake and its water supply. With the Lakota removed and Clara silenced, he could continue his poisoning operations without interference from inconvenient witnesses. "The lake belongs to all people," said White Elk, an elderly warrior, whose gray braids spoke of many battles survived. "We take only what we need and harm nothing." That's real poetic, old-timer, but poetry doesn't change territorial law. McKean produced a rolled document from his saddlebags. "Got myself a writ here from Judge Morrison giving me authority to remove squatters and vagrants from public property." Clara noticed how McKean held the paper at an angle that made its contents impossible to read. She suspected it was either completely fabricated or so broadly worded as to be legally meaningless. But out here in the wilderness, legal niceties mattered less than the number of guns each side could bring to bear. Furthermore, Crowley continued, there's the matter of stolen property. Someone broke into my office and made off with confidential business documents. I have reason to believe the thief might be hiding among your guests. His gaze found Clara, and she felt ice form in her veins. The man's eyes held the kind of casual malice that came from years of treating other people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings deserving of consideration. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara said, stepping forward despite Tokala's restraining hand on her arm. Of course you don't, darling. Crowley's smile revealed too many teeth. But just to be thorough, Sheriff McKean has warrants to search any premises where stolen goods might be concealed. McKean produced another document bearing what appeared to be an official seal. Clara Winthrop, you're wanted for questioning regarding theft and destruction of private property. Also got charges of vagrancy and public disorder, seeing as how you lack legal male guardianship. The words struck Clara like physical blows. Under territorial law, an unmarried woman had few rights and fewer protections. If McKean dragged her back to town, she could disappear into the jail system for months, while Crowley destroyed whatever evidence remained and consolidated his control over the region. She is under the protection of the Kit Fox Society, Tokala said, moving to stand beside Clara. As are all people who seek shelter in this camp. McKean's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. You threatening a lawman, boy, that's a capital offense in civilized territory. This is not civilized territory, Tokala replied with deadly calm. This is the place where honest people make their stand against corruption and murder. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, with both sides calculating odds and preparing for violence. Clara could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Children's lives hung in the balance, and her next words might determine whether they would be orphaned before the sun reached its zenith. But before she could speak, Crowley raised his hand in a gesture that managed to be both casual and threatening. Tell you what, he said, his voice deceptively reasonable. I'm a businessman, not a killer. Miss Winthrop comes back to town with us, answers a few questions about those missing documents, and there's no need for unpleasantness. You folks can pack up and find somewhere else to camp, and everybody goes home happy. And if we refuse, White Elk asked. Crowley's smile never faltered, but something cold and final entered his eyes. Well then, Sheriff McKean might have to send word to Fort Abraham Lincoln about hostile Indian activity threatening peaceful settlers. Armies always eager to protect white families from savage depredations. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Everyone present understood the implications. A single telegram could bring cavalry units down from the fort. And no amount of legal justification would matter if soldiers arrived with orders to clear the lake by any means necessary. Clara looked around the camp, seeing faces of people who had shown her kindness when she had nowhere else to turn. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, their dark eyes wide with the understanding that adults were making decisions that would shape their futures. I'll come with you, she said quietly. No. Tokala's voice carried absolute finality. You will not. I have to. You know I do. Clara turned to face him, memorizing the strong planes of his face, the steady darkness of his eyes. Don't let my fight become your people's war. She could see the struggle in his expression. Warrior's instinct warring against leader's responsibility. He was accountable for more than his own honor. Elders trusted his judgment. Children depended on his wisdom. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of command. This is not finished, Crowley. Of course not, son. Business is never finished. Crowley gestured to McKean, who approached Clara with iron shackles gleaming in his hands. Just temporarily postponed while we sort out the legal complexities. As cold metal closed around her wrists, Clara caught one last glimpse of Tokala's face. She saw fury there and grief, but also something that looked like respect. She had chosen sacrifice over bloodshed, protection of innocence, over her own freedom. It was the first genuinely courageous thing she had ever done. The Willow Springs jail squatted at the end of Main Street. Like a diseased growth, its stone walls blackened by years of prairie winds and human misery. Clara's cell was a cramped rectangle furnished with a straw mattress that reeked of previous occupants and their various failures, while a single barred window offered a view of nothing but empty sky. Sheriff McKean had deposited her there with obvious satisfaction, making a theatrical show of hanging the keys on a hook, positioned just far enough away to be taunting. "Comfortable accommodations for you, Miss Winthrop? Or should I say, Mrs. Nobody, seeing as how your husband saw fit to annul your matrimonial obligations?" Clara kept her expression neutral despite the cruelty of his words. Men like McKean fed on reactions growing stronger and more vicious when their victims showed pain. Better to starve him of the satisfaction he craved. Of course, your situation doesn't have to be permanent. McKean continued settling into his desk chair with his boots propped up like a petty king holding court. "Mr. Crowley's a reasonable man. Sign over that worthless patch of swampland you own by the lake, pay the back taxes and penalties you owe, and you can walk out of here a free woman." The offer was transparently fraudulent. Clara's lakeside property was worthless for farming, but strategically vital for Crowley's expansion plans. More importantly, her legal ownership gave her standing to challenge his operations in territorial court, assuming she lived long enough to exercise that right. "What back taxes?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. McKean consulted a ledger with theatrical precision. "Property taxes for 1880 and 81 penalty fees for delinquent payment, administrative costs, and fines for disturbing the peace. Comes to $237 plus accumulated interest." It was an impossible sum, more than Clara could earn in 3 years of honest work. McKean knew it was uncollectible, just as he knew she would never voluntarily surrender her property rights. This was merely theater designed to provide legal justification for what amounted to armed robbery. "I'll need time to consider your generous terms," she said carefully. "Naturally, Mr. Crowley's a patient man." McKean's grin showed too many teeth. "You got till sundown to make up your mind." 2 days later, Clara was awakened by the sound of approaching hoofbeats and familiar voices outside the jail. Through her barred window, she could see a mixed group of riders, Tokala, and several Lakota warriors, accompanied by Walter Briggs' Dr. Harper and other men she recognized as residents of Willow Springs. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Walter called as the group dismounted. "We need to discuss the situation at Shadow Lake." McKean appeared in the doorway, his hand hovering near his sidearm, despite being clearly outnumbered. "This is highly irregular. You can't just ride into town making demands." "We're not making demands," Dr. Harper interrupted calmly. "We're presenting evidence of criminal activity and requesting immediate action from territorial authorities." From his saddlebags, Walter produced the black ledger Clara remembered seeing in Crowley's office, somehow recovered during a raid she hadn't witnessed. The pages contained systematic documentation of environmental destruction and official corruption that implicated dozens of territorial officials. Financial records proving systematic mercury poisoning of water sources, Harper explained. Medical evidence from 17 women documenting symptoms consistent with heavy metal contamination. Testimony from multiple witnesses regarding deliberate contamination of public water supplies. McKean's face flushed red with indignation and fear. "You got no authority to." "Actually, we do." Harper produced a thick envelope from his coat. "Federal warrant from the Territorial Marshal's Office authorizing investigation of environmental crimes and official corruption. Deputy Morrison is en route from the territorial capital with full investigative authority." Clara felt her heart soar as she realized what had happened. While she'd been languishing in jail, Takala and his allies had been building an airtight case against Crowley that went far beyond her stolen documents. They had turned the tables completely, using the mining baron's own records against him. But their victory celebration was interrupted by new sounds from the direction of Copper Gulch. The rumble of explosions rolling across the prairie like distant thunder, followed by towering columns of black smoke that stained the afternoon sky. "He's destroying the evidence." Clara breathed understanding, flooding through her. Everything the federal investigators haven't seized yet. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see armed riders approaching town at full gallop. Crowley himself led the charge, his face streaked with soot and his expensive clothing torn and stained. Behind him rode his remaining gunmen, their weapons ready for the final confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone at Shadow Lake. The territorial deputy marshal arrived exactly when the telegraph had promised he would, riding a government horse and carrying dispatch cases that bore the unmistakable seals of federal authority. Deputy Samuel Morrison was perhaps 28 years old, with the earnest face of someone who had entered law enforcement with genuine ideals about constitutional government and equal justice. "Sheriff McKean," he announced as he dismounted, "I have communications from the Territorial Marshal's office regarding your reports of Indian troubles and mining disputes." McKean looked up from the whiskey he'd been sharing with Crowley, both men suddenly alert to this unexpected development. They had clearly expected military support for their version of events, not federal investigation of their activities. "About time," McKean said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We got ourselves a full-scale uprising here, Deputy. Attacks on lawful business theft of private property, threats against peaceful citizens." Morrison consulted his documents with bureaucratic precision. "Yes, sir, I have your reports. But I also have additional materials that came to light during our preliminary investigation." He produced a series of official documents, each bearing stamps and signatures that spoke of genuine federal authority. Clara pressed her face against her cell bars, straining to hear every word that might determine her fate. "Water quality analysis from the Territorial Health Commission," Morrison announced. "Chemical testing of samples from Shadow Lake and surrounding sources. The mercury contamination levels are 43 times higher than federal safety standards." Crowley's face remained impassive, but Clara noticed how his hands tightened around his glass. Any contamination would be minimal and within acceptable limits for industrial operations. "Actually, sir, the levels recorded are sufficient to cause severe health problems, including reproductive failure, neurological damage, and death." Morrison's tone remained professionally neutral. "We also have this." He produced Walter's black ledger, now marked with evidence tags and legal annotations. Financial records indicating systematic corruption involving local officials, including payments for services designed to conceal environmental violations. Furthermore, Morrison continued, "We have medical testimony from 17 women providing detailed accounts of health problems consistent with mercury poisoning. The pattern of symptoms and geographic distribution strongly suggests deliberate contamination." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the scope of what Harper and the others had accomplished. They had built a comprehensive case that transformed her from thief to victim, from criminal to whistleblower exposing environmental crimes. Most significantly, Morrison said, his voice taking on formal legal tones, "We have sworn testimony from multiple witnesses regarding attempts to cover up these crimes through intimidation, false imprisonment, and corruption of territorial officials." As Morrison continued reading charges that would destroy Crowley's empire and send him to federal prison, Clara noticed something troubling. Walter Briggs stood slightly apart from the other men, his eyes avoiding direct contact with anyone in the group. There was something wrong with his posture, a tension that spoke of internal conflict or hidden agenda. But before she could process this observation further, the sound of gunfire erupted from the hills around Copper Gulch. Through her window, Clara could see flames beginning to spread through the mining complex, accompanied by the deliberate explosions of someone destroying evidence with systematic thoroughness. The final battle for Shadow Lake was about to begin, and she realized with growing dread that not everyone would survive to see justice served. The storm that broke over Dakota territory that night was apocalyptic in its fury, as if nature itself had decided to cleanse the sins that had accumulated around Shadow Lake. Clara stood at the window of her cell, watching lightning split the sky while thunder shook the jail's foundations. And rain fell in torrents that turned dust to mud within minutes. Deputy Morrison had released her that afternoon, the federal charges dismissed as part of his investigation into Crowley's crimes. But freedom had brought its own terrors. The knowledge that Crowley was still at large, still dangerous, and undoubtedly planning some final desperate gambit to escape justice or destroy those who threatened him. Through the storm's chaos, she could see lights moving in the hills around Copper Gulch, far more activity than any legitimate mining operation would require. The pattern of movement suggested men setting charges for controlled demolition, preparing to destroy everything that might serve as evidence of systematic environmental destruction. He's not just eliminating records. Dr. Harper observed, joining her at the window, as the first explosions began to light up the night sky. Those charges are positioned to bring down the entire dam structure. Clara felt ice form in her veins as she understood the implications. If Shadow Lake's dam fails during this storm, the entire valley floods. The town, the Lakota camp, everything downstream gets washed away. Crowley can claim it was a natural disaster caused by the storm, maybe blame it on Indian sabotage of the mining equipment. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. Crowley wasn't just trying to destroy evidence, he was planning to eliminate all the witnesses by creating a catastrophic flood that would kill hundreds of innocent people. "We have to warn them," she said, already reaching for her coat. "Clara, no. It's suicide to go out in this storm, and Crowley's men will shoot anyone who tries to interfere with their operation." But Clara was already moving toward the door, her mind racing through possibilities. The direct route to Shadow Lake would be heavily guarded, but there were other paths, deer trails through the Willows Creek beds, that might offer concealment even in the driving rain. "Then we give him what he expects," she said. "But not the way he expects it." The storm provided perfect cover for her approach to the lake, though it also made every step treacherous. Rain fell in sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet, while wind howled through the cottonwoods with enough force to knock a person down. Clara moved through the deluge like a ghost, following paths she had learned during her brief time in the Lakota camp. She was still half a mile from the lake when she encountered Tokala and 3 other warriors making their way through the storm toward the same destination. Their faces were painted for war, and their weapons gleamed wetly in the intermittent lightning flashes. "You should not be here," Tokala said, though his tone held gratitude rather than anger. "Crowley's planning to destroy the dam." Clara gasped, water streaming from her hair. "Create a flood that will kill everyone who can testify against him." "We know. Walter Briggs brought word to our camp an hour ago." Tokala's expression was grim as he gestured toward the distant lights. "But this is not just about the dam. Crowley has taken hostages." Clara's heart clenched with fear. "Who?" "Little Fox and 2 other children from the camp. They were gathering late berries when Crowley's men found them. Now he has them at the dam site, threatening to kill them if we interfere with his operation." The news hit Clara like a physical blow. Little Fox was barely 7 years old, an orphan who had attached himself to her during her stay in the camp. The thought of that innocent child being used as leverage in Crowley's desperate gambit filled her with rage that transcended her own fear. "There's more," Tokala continued. "Walter says Crowley has enough dynamite planted to not only destroy the dam, but create a massive explosion that will be visible from 3 territories. He plans to time it with the storm's peak, making it look like natural disaster rather than deliberate destruction. As they approached the dam site through the driving rain, Clara could see the full scope of Crowley's preparations. Lanterns moved in precise patterns around the structure, marking the positions of men who had spent hours placing explosive charges with military precision. The dam itself was already showing signs of stress from the storm, with water seeping through cracks in the earthwork and the spillway running at dangerous levels. But it was the sight of three small figures huddled near the main control house that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Little Fox and two other children sat with their hands bound, guarded by one of Crowley's gunmen, while the mining baron himself directed the final preparations for his apocalyptic plan. When the charges detonate, they die with everyone else, Clara said quietly. Unless we can reach them first. Clara studied the layout with desperate calculation. The dam's control mechanisms were housed in a stone building that might offer some protection from the explosion, but reaching it would require crossing 50 yards of open ground under the guns of Crowley's men. There's another way, she said suddenly, an idea forming in her mind. The spillway tunnel. If we can get inside the dam structure, we might be able to defuse enough charges to prevent complete collapse. It was a desperate plan that might easily result in their deaths, but it offered the only chance of saving the children and preventing a massacre that would claim hundreds of innocent lives. The tunnel entrance is on the far side away from the guards, Clara observed. But once we're inside, there's no retreat. If the charges detonate while we're in there, or then we die trying to save lives instead of watching innocents be murdered. Clara finished. Some things are worth that risk. What followed was the most terrifying journey of Clara's life. Moving through the storm-lashed darkness with Clara and his warriors, she crept toward the tunnel entrance while explosions continued to light up the sky and gunfire erupted sporadically around the dam site. The spillway tunnel was a man-made cavern carved through solid rock designed to channel overflow water during spring floods. Now it offered their only hope of reaching the dam's interior without being detected by Crowley's sentries. The air inside was thick with moisture, and the constant rumble of water flowing through hidden channels while their footsteps echoed ominously in the confined space. The main charges will be positioned at the dam's foundation, Clara whispered as they navigated the treacherous footing. If we can disconnect even half of them, the structure might survive long enough for people to evacuate. They had been working in the tunnel for perhaps 20 minutes, carefully diffusing explosive charges with tools salvaged from Crowley's own equipment, when Clara heard voices approaching from behind. She turned to see Walter Briggs emerging from the tunnel entrance, accompanied by two armed men she didn't recognize. That's far enough. Walter called out his voice, carrying a tone of authority that sent ice through Clara's veins. Step away from those charges and put down your weapons. The betrayal hit Clara like a physical blow as she realized the truth. Walter's supposed conversion to their cause had been an elaborate deception designed to lure them into exactly this trap. His guilt and remorse had been nothing more than skilled acting, while his real loyalty remained with Crowley and the profits that came from environmental destruction. You played your part well, she said bitterly, raising her hands as Walter's companions trained their rifles on the group. You had to be convincing, Walter replied without apparent remorse. Crowley needed you to trust me enough to reveal your plans and bring your Indian friends into the open. Now we've got all the troublemakers in one place about to be eliminated by an unfortunate mining accident. Clara's face remained impassive, but Clara could see the self-recrimination in his dark eyes. As a leader, he had made the decision to trust Walter's testimony, and now his people would pay the price for that misjudgment. The children, Clara said desperately. Little Fox and the others, their innocence in this. Let them go, and I'll tell you where we hid the remaining evidence. Walter's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. What makes you think we care about evidence? In about 10 minutes, this whole dam is going up in smoke. The flood will wash away the mining complex, the Indian camp, and half the town. Nobody's going to be investigating anything because there won't be anybody left to investigate. Through the tunnel walls, Clara could hear the rumble of approaching thunder, or perhaps it was the sound of water building up behind the weakened dam structure. Either way, time was running out with terrifying speed. "Now move," Walter commanded, gesturing with his rifle toward the tunnel exit. "Crowley wants to see you before the grand finale." As they emerged from the tunnel into the storm's fury, Clara found herself face to face with Silas Crowley for the first time since her escape from his office. The mining baron stood near the dam's control house, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by wind and rain, but his eyes burning with fanatic intensity. "Miss Winthrop," he said with mock courtesy. "So good of you to join us for the evening's entertainment." Around them, the scene was one of barely controlled chaos. Crowley's remaining men moved with urgent purpose, making final preparations for an explosion that would be heard across 3 territories. The children huddled nearby, their young faces reflecting terror they were too young to fully understand. "Let them go," Clara said, gesturing toward Little Fox and his companions. "They have nothing to do with this fight." "On the contrary," Crowley replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining simple facts to a slow child. "They have everything to do with it. You see, my dear, this was never really about mining profits or environmental regulations. This was about justice." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm as she realized she was looking into the eyes of genuine madness. Whatever had originally motivated Crowley's crimes, it had evolved into something far more dangerous than simple greed. "Justice," she repeated. "My wife died 3 years ago." Crowley continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject. "Died of fever in this godforsaken wilderness, while the so-called civilized people of this territory, white and Indian alike, did nothing to help her. Oh, they had excuses. Not enough medicine too far to travel other priorities. But I knew the truth." His eyes were bright with unshed tears and barely controlled rage. "They let her die because she was married to a man who dug wealth from the earth instead of stealing it from weaker neighbors. Because she was an outsider who didn't fit their cozy little community of mutual protection." Clara began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't a desperate criminal trying to escape justice. This was a man who had spent years planning systematic revenge against an entire community that he blamed for his personal tragedy. "So I decided to return the favor," Crowley continued. "If they wouldn't save my family, I would make sure they couldn't save theirs. Mercury in the water supply bribes to officials systematic destruction of everything they valued. I wanted them to watch their children die the way I watched mine die." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Clara realized she was looking at a man who had deliberately murdered dozens of unborn children as an act of calculated revenge, using environmental destruction as a weapon of mass murder. And now, Crowley said, his voice taking on the satisfied tone of someone nearing the completion of a long-planned project, "I'm going to finish what I started. This flood will wash away every trace of the communities that failed my family. The Indian camp of the town, all of it gone in one glorious act of divine retribution." Lightning split the sky as he spoke, illuminating the scene with stark white light that made everything look like a photograph of hell. In that moment of brilliant illumination, Clara saw something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. More figures were moving through the storm toward the dam site, not Crowley's men, but riders approaching from the direction of town. Dr. Harper, Nora Bell, and at least a dozen other residents of Willow Springs, all armed and moving with the determined purpose of people who had finally decided to take a stand against corruption and murder. But they were still too far away to prevent the catastrophe Crowley had planned. The detonation charges were already in place, the timer mechanisms were running, and in less than 5 minutes enough explosives would detonate to destroy the dam and create a flood that would kill hundreds of innocent people. Clara looked at the children huddled nearby at Tokala, and his warriors held at gunpoint at the approaching townspeople who didn't yet realize they were riding into a trap. In that moment of crystal clarity, she understood what she had to do. "You want justice," she said to Crowley, her voice cutting through the storm's howl. "Then let's settle this between us. One-on-one winner takes all. If you kill me, detonate your charges and have your revenge. If I win, you call off this madness and face legal justice for your crimes." Crowley's eyes narrowed as he considered her proposal. Around them, his men looked uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of mass murder, even if they were willing to commit individual acts of violence for money. "What makes you think I'd honor such an agreement?" he asked. "Because you're not just a killer." Clara replied, gambling everything on her reading of his twisted psychology. "You're a man who believes he's been wronged, who wants the world to acknowledge the justice of his cause. Murdering children in a flood makes you a monster. Defeating me in single combat makes you a righteous avenger." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Crowley stood frozen in indecision. Then he nodded slowly, his hand moving to the revolver at his side. "Very well, Miss Winthrop. Let's see if your courage matches your convictions." The duel that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever imagined. Not the formal affair of novels and newspaper stories, but a desperate struggle for survival played out on rain-slicked stones while lightning illuminated their movements and thunder masked the sound of gunshots. Crowley was faster than she had expected, his first shot coming close enough to burn her cheek as she dove for cover behind a pile of mining equipment. But desperation made her quick, and she rolled behind a steam engine just as his second bullet struck sparks from the metal boiler. "You can't hide forever." Crowley called out, his voice carrying easily over the storm's noise. "My men have orders to detonate the charges in 3 minutes, whether I'm alive or dead. You're just postponing the inevitable." Clara realized he was probably telling the truth, which meant she had to end this quickly or watch everyone she cared about die in the resulting flood. Gripping the small pistol Dr. Harper had given her for protection, she made her choice. Instead of continuing to seek cover, she stood up and walked directly toward Crowley, her weapon held steady despite the rain that streamed down her face. Her movement was so unexpected, so contrary to survival instinct, that he hesitated for a crucial fraction of a second. "This ends now," she said, and pulled the trigger. The bullet took Crowley in the chest, spinning him around and sending his own weapon flying into the darkness. He fell to his knees on the slick stones, one hand pressed to his wound, while the other scrabbled uselessly for his lost gun. "The charges," Clara said urgently, kneeling beside him. "How do we stop the detonation?" Crowley looked up at her with eyes that were already beginning to glaze with approaching death. For a moment she thought he might refuse to answer, might choose to take his revenge to the grave. Then he smiled, an expression so filled with malice that it made her blood run cold. "You can't," he whispered. "I lied about the timer. The charges are set to detonate when my heart stops beating. Kill me, and you kill everyone." Clara felt the world tilt around her as she realized the full scope of his final trap. He had engineered the situation so that his death would trigger the very catastrophe she was trying to prevent. Victory would become defeat. Justice would become mass murder. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she heard new sounds cutting through the storm and the voices of the approaching townspeople, much closer now, led by Dr. Harper's authoritative commands. They had reached the dam site and were beginning to spread out, preparing to assault Crowley's positions from multiple directions. "Harper," she called out desperately. "The charges are rigged to his heartbeat. If he dies, they all detonate." The doctor appeared at her side with remarkable speed, his medical bag already in his hands as he knelt beside the wounded man. "How long has he been shot?" "Less than a minute. Can you save him?" Harper's hands moved with practiced efficiency, examining the wound and applying pressure to slow the bleeding. "Maybe." The bullet missed his heart and major arteries, but he's losing blood fast. "I need to get him to proper surgical facilities immediately." Around them, the battle for control of the dam was reaching its climax. Crowley's demoralized men were surrendering one by one, as the townspeople overwhelmed their positions, while Tokala and his warriors freed the children and began evacuating them to safety. But none of that would matter if Crowley died before they could safely defuse the explosive charges that threatened to destroy everything they were fighting to protect. "There's something else," Walter Briggs said, approaching with his hands raised in surrender. "The timer mechanism. It's not just tied to his heartbeat, it's also set to detonate if anyone tries to tamper with the charges without knowing the proper sequence." Clara looked at him with contempt and growing desperation. "What sequence? I don't know. Crowley never told anyone the full plan in case someone got captured and talked." Walter's face was pale with genuine fear. "All I know is that we have maybe 10 minutes before the backup detonation system activates automatically." The situation was impossible. They couldn't kill Crowley without triggering the charges, couldn't let him die naturally without the same result, and couldn't defuse the explosives without knowing a sequence that only Crowley himself possessed. But as Clara stared down at the dying man who had caused so much suffering, an idea began to form in her mind. It was desperate, potentially suicidal, but it might be their only chance of preventing the catastrophe he had planned. "Keep him alive," she told Harper urgently. "Whatever it takes, don't let him die for the next 10 minutes. "Where are you going?" Tokala asked as she rose to her feet. "To find another way to stop this." Clara replied, already moving toward the dam's control mechanisms. "If we can't defuse the charges, maybe we can channel the explosion in a way that won't cause a catastrophic flood." What she had in mind would require precise timing, detailed knowledge of the dam's construction, and more luck than any reasonable person had a right to expect. But as she studied the massive structure that held back Shadow Lake's waters, she began to see possibilities that Crowley's madness had overlooked. The spillway system was designed to handle massive water flow during spring floods, but it had never been tested with the kind of explosive force Crowley had prepared. If she could redirect that force through the spillway channels, rather than allowing it to destroy the dam's foundation, the structure might survive long enough for people to evacuate the flood zone. Working with desperate efficiency, Clara began repositioning some of the explosive charges, moving them from their intended positions at the dam's base to locations that would direct their force along the spillway, rather than through the earthwork embankment. It was delicate work that required her to crawl through spaces barely large enough for her body, all while water seeped through cracks in the stonework, and the storm continued to rage overhead. 60 seconds. Harper called out from where he was working to keep Crowley alive through sheer medical skill and determination. Clara made the final connection in the redirected detonation sequence, then began the dangerous journey back through the spillway tunnel. The charges would still create a massive explosion, but now their force would be channeled through the stone spillway, rather than destroying the entire dam structure. She emerged from the tunnel just as Harper called out the final countdown. 10 seconds. Everyone who could reach high ground did so, while those who couldn't simply pressed themselves against whatever solid objects they could find and hoped for the best. Clara found herself beside Tokala, his strong arm around her shoulders, as they waited for an explosion that would either save or destroy everything they had fought to protect. The detonation, when it came, was beyond anything Clara had imagined. The ground beneath their feet heaved like a living thing, while a column of flame and debris rose hundreds of feet into the storm-torn sky. The sound was indescribable, not just noise, but a physical force that seemed to shake her bones apart and drive the breath from her lungs. But the dam held. Water poured through the damaged spillway in torrents that would have been catastrophic under normal circumstances, but the structure's foundation remained intact. Instead of a killing flood that would have swept away everything downstream, there was merely fast-moving water that spread across the valley floor in patterns that could be survived by anyone with basic sense and quick reflexes. As dawn broke over the transformed landscape, Clara stood with Tokala on the ridge overlooking what had once been Copper Gulch. The mining complex was gone, washed away by the artificial flood they had created, and Crowley lay unconscious in Dr. Harper's makeshift field hospital with federal marshals standing guard over his bedside. "Is it finally over?" she asked, watching muddy water continue to pour through the broken spillway. This battle is over," Clara replied. "But the work of rebuilding what was destroyed, of healing what was poisoned, that will take years." Clara nodded, understanding that their victory was incomplete. The legal proceedings would drag on for months, and the environmental damage would take decades to fully repair, and the scars left by systematic corruption would require constant vigilance to prevent their return. But as she looked across the valley toward the Lakota camp, where children were already playing in puddles left by the receding flood, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope for the future. The trials concluded just before Christmas, with Silas Crowley convicted on charges that included environmental destruction, conspiracy to commit mass murder, and systematic corruption of territorial officials. His confession, obtained while he recovered from his gunshot wound, had provided evidence that sent a dozen accomplices to prison and resulted in the removal of corrupt officials throughout the territory. Walter Briggs received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony, though Clara suspected he would carry the weight of his betrayal for the rest of his life. Sheriff McKean and Judge Morrison faced their own legal consequences, while the systematic corruption that had enabled Crowley's crimes was being methodically dismantled by federal authorities. But for Clara, the most meaningful outcome was not legal, but personal. The federal government had established a compensation fund for victims of mercury poisoning, providing both financial support and official acknowledgement that 17 women had been systematically poisoned rather than naturally barren. Spring brought new life to Shadow Lake in ways that transcended the seasonal return of wildlife and wildflowers. The water ran cleaner than it had in decades, supporting fish populations that had been nearly extinct during the years of contamination. Birds returned to areas that had been poisoned, and the very air seemed fresher without the constant smoke from Crowley's processing operations. In the small cabin Clara now shared with Little Fox, she felt the unmistakable signs of new life growing within her own body. Dr. Harper confirmed what she already knew after months of clean water, proper nutrition, and freedom from the stress that had marked her previous pregnancies. She was carrying a healthy child. "No magic," she told Clara when she shared the news with him on a warm evening in late May. "Just a woman's body healing from poison given time and proper care." The wedding took place in midsummer on the shores of Shadow Lake, with representatives from both communities in attendance. Nora Bells served as matron of honor, while Tasunke, who had returned in spring after being presumed dead, stood as Tokala's best man. The ceremony blended traditions in ways that would have been impossible just a year earlier. Christian vows were spoken in English. Lakota prayers were offered to the four directions, and the celebration that followed included music and dancing from both cultures. As Clara and Tokala stood together under a canopy of stars, she marveled at how different this wedding was from her first. This felt like a beginning rather than a surrender, a choice made in hope rather than desperation. The schoolhouse they built together drew students from across the territory and beyond. Young Lakota learned to read and write while maintaining their connection to traditional knowledge, while white children discovered that their Indian classmates possessed intelligence and cultural richness that challenged every stereotype they had been taught. As winter approached and Clara's pregnancy entered its final months, she stood at the schoolhouse window watching children of both races play together in the yard. Her hand rested on her growing belly, while the other held Little Fox's latest drawing, a picture of their family standing beside the lake with the new baby included in the group. The child would be born in spring when ice broke up, and the lake came alive with returning birds. He or she would grow up in a world where water ran clean, where children of different races learned together, where the sins of the past were acknowledged, but not allowed to poison the future. "No magic," Clara murmured, watching Lakota and white children build snow forts together. just love work and the stubborn refusal to let hatred win. Behind her, the schoolhouse filled with children's voices, Lakota and English, mixed together in a symphony of learning and hope. Outside Shadow Lake reflected the enormous Dakota sky, its waters clean and clear for the first time in a generation. But as she prepared to call the children inside for afternoon lessons, Clara noticed a rider approaching from town. The man's official bearing and the dispatch case secured to his saddle suggested important news from the territorial capital. Deputy Morrison dismounted and approached with documents bearing federal seals. As Clara read through the legal language, tears sprang to her eyes at what she found. The federal government was establishing new environmental protection standards for mining operations throughout the territories. What had happened at Shadow Lake would serve as a model for preventing similar crimes elsewhere, while the compensation fund for mercury poisoning victims was being expanded to cover other communities that had suffered similar exploitation. 17 women will receive official recognition that they were victims of deliberate poisoning. Morrison explained. Their suffering has been acknowledged, and new laws will prevent others from experiencing the same injustice. As the deputy rode away, Clara felt a deep sense of completion. The battle that had begun with her desperate theft of incriminating documents had ended not just with personal vindication, but with systemic changes that would protect other communities from similar exploitation. That evening, as sunset painted Shadow Lake in shades of gold and crimson, Clara sat beside Tokala on their cabin porch. Little Fox was inside, practicing his letters while their unborn child stirred gently in her womb. "It's truly finished now," she said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "This fight is finished," Tokala agreed. "But there will be others. There always are when people choose justice over comfort." Clara nodded, understanding that their work was far from over. The school would continue growing, the community would face new challenges, and there would always be those who sought profit from others' suffering. But tonight, it was enough to sit in peace beside the man she loved, listening to their son practice his lessons while their unborn child grew strong within her. She had found her place in the world, not as the failed wife she had once believed herself to be, but as a teacher mother and fighter for justice when justice was needed. As stars appeared in the vast Dakota sky, Clara allowed herself to feel complete contentment. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. The wind carried sounds of children's laughter from the settlement Lakota and English voices raised together in the universal language of play. Tomorrow would bring new lessons to teach new bridges, to build between cultures, learning to see each other as family. But tonight, Clara Tokala was simply a woman blessed beyond measure, counting her wealth in clean water, healthy children, and the love of a man who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to stand with her anyway. It was more than enough. It was everything.